Hello, Bad-Tempered Badger here, to discuss something with this guy. I'll do the intro in post-production.
Would that be me?
Let's do the intro in post-production.
You can tack that on anytime.
Yeah. So, I'm talking to you. What's the topic? It's the atheism and agnostic definitions thing, isn't it?
Probably. Isn't it always? I guess that's what I'm known for anymore.
Well, I'm here with
I'm not
Steve.
a one-trick pony. I do talk about other things, no.
Yeah, so I'm here with... How do you pronounce your name?
Steve. Not complicated.
Not the Steve part.
Oh.
I can pronounce Steve. I may be British.
McRae.
McRae.
I mean, people can call it McRae. The original from Ireland, I guess, was McRae, but it's been anglicized, so it's McRae. It's like McDonald's. Right. Yeah, McRae.
All right, well, let's do it this way. I'm here today with Steve McRae.
Yeah.
Great intro.
Perfect. You nailed it.
We're here to talk about...
Always good when I get the name right.
Yeah. I'm here today with Steve McRae, and we're here to talk about the agnostic/atheist thing definitions argument that's been going on for a little while now. That's where you come in.
Oh, that's... Oh, okay. Well, hey, let me. By the way, you can't edit these things.
I never edit in my life.
Yeah.
No.
Editing is difficult. I know.
I generally edit. Yeah.
Look, they're not definitional arguments, and I really need to get this message out there that when people say that Steve's arguing definitions, I'm not, and I'm making that very, very clear. If you think it's definitional, then you don't understand anything I'm talking about. I have argued some definitions have more utility. I have argued that some definitions are more precise, but I've never argued ever in the 5 years I've had a YouTube channel such that only one definition is correct, right? And that's the kind of narrative that I get a pushback on. Steve thinks that such and such definition is the only correct definition. No, actually, my argument is counter to that. My argument is there are multiple definitions, because I over the years I've heard many atheists say that the only definition for an atheist is somebody who doesn't have a belief in God, which that's clearly not true, and people now are recognizing that, but they were never exposed to that over a period of time watching just YouTube videos, right?
Well, that's kind of the thing there, which I came into this whole, air quotes, community by way of essentially watching lots of different people discuss it, mostly on YouTube. I started off seeing things by Christopher Hitchens and Dawkins and the Horsemen, as they tend to be known. Then I discovered other, YouTube people talking about it, and almost all of the people that I was kind of introduced to the subject, well, not the subject, but the kind of set how the words are used in my mind, used the lack of belief way of looking at things. So I come at it from that perspective, as that's where I started.
And that's common because that's what they're exposed to, right? But I mean, as soon as they look into it and as soon as they read more philosophical literature, they go, oh, well, that's not the only way to define it. And in philosophy, people are recognizing that that's not the standard. In philosophy, the standard is that atheism is a belief that theism is false, the rejection of theism, or that there are no gods, and that's an ontological position, but there are no gods in the universe. And that's ubiquitous in any accredited university. That's ubiquitous in modern literature on the topic. That's ubiquitous in any peer-reviewed paper in modern times on the topic, with a handful of outliers. Flew, Boulevard, and Smith would probably be the three outliers, I would say. But the rest, they all have the usage of the word atheism to mean the belief that gods do not exist. So. But people, like you said, they don't get exposed to that. If all they've ever watched is a YouTube video, and you have people on YouTube channels going, well, the only definition of atheism is that you don't believe. If you don't believe, you're an atheist, period. And it's by necessity. It's by entailment, or there's a dichotomy, either theist or atheist. No, that's completely wrong. And again, I think people are recognizing that, and that's why a lot of people are listening to me more than you would think, because I'm giving them information they've never been exposed to before.
Well, I think it's an interesting discussion, although it does tend to turn into a bit of a shouting match on the Twitter. And I personally, no matter what subject I'm discussing, I usually find that the person I'm discussing with has a different definition of the title and terms used within that topic than I do. So generally, if I'm discussing a topic with someone, I try to get them to state what they mean by something before I continue.
Well, of course, but the thing is, if the person you're discussing these subjects with do not even understand that there's alternative and actually more common definitions out there, and I mean common within philosophy, then how do you get around that, right? Because they'll sit there and say, well, Steve, that's not the usual definition people talk about in atheist circles. Well, depends what atheist circles. I have a group of atheists, and 75% of them, last poll, give or take, accepted the strong atheist version of atheism for a definition, right? So it depends on what group you're talking about. But if somebody doesn't even recognize that in philosophy atheism is a belief, then where do you go from there? Because they don't bother to go even look into this. They just say by fiat that no, that's not right. You have to be a theist or atheist. That clearly is not the case if there's other definitions out there, more precise, called sensu stricto definitions, that do not have atheism and theism as a dichotomy. They have them as what's called contradictories, meaning if one is false, one has to be true.
Mm-hmm. Well, I generally, as I mentioned, the people that I am often in discussions with on the atheist side of things are people who come from the lack of belief perspective. So that is the one that I, other than, as well as being where I sort of originally started in this thing, it's the one I'm most frequently exposed to in discussion as well. I do come across the philosophical definitions and usages in discussions. There was one guy that I did a debate with a while ago who preferred those definitions, and I found that wasn't really a sticking point in the debate, because I'm fairly sure there aren't gods. So I'm pretty much arguing for a strong atheist position, even though I don't quite hold the strong atheist. I don't definitely believe there are no gods.
Well, why? Well, first, why do you think that the strong atheist position is definitely? That's not what strong atheism is. That's not philosophical atheism. You don't have to be sure, right? You just have to be convinced. If I say, are you convinced that there are no gods? Then you're a strong atheist. You're a philosophical atheist. That's it.
I'm not 100% convinced.
You don't have to be
I see no
convinced
evidence
means
that
you
there
have
are.
a belief. It doesn't mean 100%.
I see no evidence that there are, and I consider going back to the old talking points, I consider the absence of evidence to be evidence of absence.
Right, but do you? Okay, so if I asked you the question, do you believe there's a God?
No.
Or gods, right? Or some formulation of that. Do you believe that gods exist? Do you answer yes or no?
I answer no.
Okay, so you don't have a God belief. Now, if I ask you the question, which is the great debate community question, it's the question that's been around for thousands of years: does God exist? Because now I'm not specifically asking about belief more as ontology, right? What's your belief about the ontology of God? So, does God exist?
I'm not certain, but probably not.
Yes, it's a yes or no. I don't know.
Yes or no, or I don't know. In that case, I don't know.
Really? Okay. So you would say that you don't have a belief that gods exist, and you don't have a belief that gods do not exist, correct?
If I had to split it into those three answers, I'd pick I don't know, but I lean quite far towards no.
Okay. But the answers you're giving is that you do not have a belief either way. Okay. That is philosophical agnosticism. That is what is defined to be by Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Agnosticism is the psychological state of being agnostic on P, where agnostic is you don't have a position that is true, you don't have a position that's false. So, in that regard, would you agree that you are philosophically agnostic? on this particular topic.
Using those definitions, yeah.
Yeah. So
that's kind of why I use the title agnostic atheist, because that it covers both sets of definitions that are commonly used. If you're looking at it from the philosophical perspective, you put agnostic, and if you're looking at it from the colloquial lack of belief perspective, then you put atheist. Well,
so let me ask you, how is a person, when they hear agnostic atheist, supposed to know what stipulated way you're using it? Doesn't that add to confusion when there a lot of people have agreed that the usage of agnostic atheism in the weak case, meaning defining atheism as just merely somebody who doesn't believe, is epistemologically nonsensical, because knowledge is a subset of belief, right? So you can't take a word like atheism and then not put it as a belief position and then try to epistemically modify it with something that's referring to knowledge. It's just, it doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur. So
that's the name of your show, isn't it?
Yes, it is, by the way. That was a good plug. Thank you very much. But it does make sense in the strong case, and the reason by that is, if atheism is defined as a belief that there are no gods, then you can modify it with knowledge, because you're working with a belief. Now you're going to make a subset of that, which is knowledge. But at that point, it's superfluous, because what's the difference? What's the distinction between somebody who says, I believe there are no gods, but I'm not making it a knowledge claim, which would be atheism in philosophy, and somebody who says, I believe that there are no gods, but not making it a knowledge claim, which would be agnostic atheism? They are the exact same thing. There's no distinction between them.
Well, I suppose the first question you asked me there was, how would someone know which way I'm using the words? And I said, well, they ask me.
Well, I mean, of course that could be, but the point of having these discussions is that we want things to be pretty well simplistic. If somebody gives you an identifier or moniker or position, you kind of know where they're coming from. I don't want to play 5,000 questions just to understand what somebody's stipulated definition of agnostic atheism is. To me, it's just a waste of my time, because every single time it's either going to be nonsensical or it's going to be just redundant.
Well, yeah, I can see where you're coming from there.
So let me ask you why you don't take the position that there are no gods, because people will often say that agnostics are fence sitters, right? And that is true. I mean, they on the fence between the belief that gods exist and between that and the belief that gods don't exist, as opposed to a theist and an atheist. You have their feet on the ground, meaning that they've taken a position, right? Yeah. So the people that merely say atheism is just somebody who doesn't believe in God, which is a colloquial definition, and anybody has it, they can use that. I don't argue that definition is wrong. What I argue is I think that definition comes with baggage that many atheists don't want to deal with. But why would you not take the position that there are no gods when many atheists out there are happy to do so, own their burden of proof on that, and then give their burden of proof and try to convince the theist that they're wrong?
Because I'm not necessarily certain that there definitely aren't beings that could be called gods. Say that again, sorry?
You've used that word certainty numerous times, and yet nothing involved in these conversations requires certainty. Knowledge doesn't require certainty, except if you hold to what's called a strong case belief condition, then knowledge entails certainty. But that's not how it generally is. Usually, it's called a weak case belief condition, where knowledge does not entail certainty, but it does entail belief. So why do you keep thinking that these things have anything to do with being certain?
I'd rather be certain than believe something on a faulty premise.
So if you're certain of something, that would be knowledge. So you're saying you don't have any beliefs, all you have is knowledge?
No. I have beliefs which, well, I've heard it said, I think it might have been you that said it, I'm not sure. A belief is a subset of knowledge. There are things that I believe that I don't objectively verify or can't objectively verify, and there are things that I do my best to objectively verify. So, in the case of a God existing, there's so much uncertainty around what a god even could be and whether it would be possible for that thing to exist. There are so many different definitions of the word god that I don't feel entirely confident saying that I'm definitely certain that there aren't, or that I believe there aren't, because someone could give me a credible definition for a god that I might think, oh, there could be something like that.
But do you notice how you're hedging your belief position, and you're being definite, and you're being certain? You're just kind of hedging your statements here, right? If you take away the certainty and you take away knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
A person who just says, "I believe P is true," they could be wrong, but they're just making a belief claim, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't have certainty. They don't have verificationism of it. They don't have, complete Cartesian certainty of it, but they just hold a belief, right? So you don't hold a belief that there are no gods?
Well, I suppose part of the reason that I don't want to say for, I'm not going to say certainty, because we'll go back around that conversation again. Part of the reason I don't want to say I believe there are no gods as, a clear belief claim is then there's the burden of proof aspect.
But so what? Why would you not want the burden of proof? Everybody who has a position, whether you have a position one way or another, and I argue that even if you don't take a position, if you reject somebody's claim, you still have a burden of proof. It's just a second order. Mm-hmm. So even if you don't take a position, you still have a burden of proof. Now, I have that argument that's been out there for about a couple months now, I guess, and it's making waves in the atheist community because I argue from a very logical position, using logic and sound, that any atheist, whether you are just somebody who doesn't have a belief or that you believe there are no gods, has a type of burden of proof. Mm-hmm. So why would you not want a burden of proof? This is what I can't understand when people say things like, well, that means you have a burden of proof. So what? That's a good thing. You want to have a burden of proof if you're going into these conversations, or what's the point of going into a conversation if all you're going to do is sit there and say, well, I don't believe you and I don't have a burden of proof. That's not a dialectic.
I don't say that I don't have a burden of proof for lack of belief, but that burden of proof is less than a positive assertion.
Fully agree with that.
What I mean by that in this context is, in order to prove that I don't believe something, all I need to prove is that there are sensible reasons for me to look at that, whatever the claim is, and say, no, that's faulty, or that doesn't have enough backing to convince me. Whereas if I'm trying to assert a position that there are no gods, then not only do I have a burden of proof that is the same as the theist burden of proof in regards to their assertion that there are gods, or there is a god for monotheists. Not only do I have that burden of proof, the burden of proof is a greater burden because I am attempting to prove a negative.
See, I kind of disagree. I think actually I could make a good argument that the theist has a higher burden of proof. Okay, but let's not compare who has a higher burden of proof. Sure, they both have a burden of proof. We do agree upon that. Mm-hmm. But again, why is that a bad thing? I really am trying to wrap my head around why some atheists think having a burden of proof is a bad thing. A burden of proof means that you hold a position and are justified to do it. So if I have these reasons, if I have all these arguments why I believe that gods don't exist, and I can express them to somebody, part of a burden of persuasion, which is actually an evidential, not an epistemic burden. But if I can show them these evidences that I have that there are no gods, if I was a philosophical atheist, I could convince somebody to change their mind. Why are you in a discussion with a theist if you're not interested in changing their mind, or having an actual productive dialogue on it? Well, if two people came to a dialectic and neither one of them had a burden of proof, what kind of discussion is that?
Well, let me go back to the burden of proof thing a sec. Mm-hmm. So, proving a positive as opposed to proving a negative. Let's use the example of proving that a person is in a house.
Well, you're already going down a wrong path. But let me stop you before you even go further. First of all, you can prove a negative. It's called modus tollens, or called proof by impossibility. But that's nothing to do with the burden of proof. Burden of proof, and I'm going to make this very, very succinctly clear, burden of proof in this context, when it comes to epistemology, has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with proving anything. And this is where people get confused because they think of legal reasons. And in legalities, the burden of proof is actually a little bit different. They have the burden of persuasion and the burden of production. But those are evidential, meaning you have to have some kind of evidence to meet those burdens. But an epistemic burden of proof is not evidential. So when we say that you have a burden of proof as a theist, or you have a burden of proof as an atheist, we're not talking about an evidential burden of proof. We're talking about an epistemic burden of proof, which means that all you have to do is justify that belief to be rational. So if I say, look, I believe there are no gods, and somebody says, Steve, why don't you believe that there are, why do you hold a belief that there are no gods? And again, this is hypothetical. I'd be like, well, if I add up all the arguments that I know against gods, the logical problem of evil, the evidential problem of evil, the problem of divine hinderness, the problem that we have no a posteriori knowledge of gods, it's all been a priori handed down to us from other people, right? The properties of gods are very similar to fictitious creatures, right? I mean, nobody's ever seen something like, for example, the properties of Superman. Nobody's discovered the properties of Superman, right? Because they were told to us by people that were writing about Superman, right? They say Superman has this ability to fly. And that's very similar to what we see in the narrative of things like gods. The abilities gods have and the descriptions of gods have always come through people, right? We've never gone out and said, hey, I've discovered this god with this particular property, right? So there's an analogy to be had there. Now, I would make the argument, probabilistically, given all those conditions, it is more likely the case that there are no gods. Therefore, I am justified to believe that there are no gods. That's all you do. That is my burden of proof. I met it. I'm done at that point. That's all a strong atheist has to do.
Well, let me come at it from this angle then.
Sure.
That's how I think. I'm not 100% certain about this, using certainty again. But I think that's a philosophical way of looking at the discussion from what I would term academic philosophy. And the reason I put the title academic philosophy on it is because philosophy in academia is a very specific subject with very specific terminology and rules of engagement and specific ways that conversations are had, which I don't know. I'm not going to say I don't talk philosophy, because then someone will say, well, any conversation about anything's philosophy, or any conversation about the subject of gods existing or not existing is philosophy. So I'm not going to say I don't talk philosophy, but I will say I don't talk academic philosophy, because I don't know all of the various ins and outs of how philosophical conversations are had. And it's not really an area that I want to get to delve into too deeply, partly because I think it's extremely complicated for a layman who wasn't taught it growing up, and also because most of, I'm not going to say all, because I'm discussing it with you, who frequently talks from a philosophical perspective, and I've had conversations and debates with other people who do that have been productive, but more often than not, the people who I encounter who discuss things from an academic philosophical perspective tend to be rather up their own arse, and the conversation essentially devolves into, look at these big philosophy names I know, as opposed to, let me discuss the points you've raised.
No, and I get that. Some people use philosophy as a weapon, but you got to remember,
like Mr. Master Apologist, for example.
He's an example of somebody who doesn't know what the frick he's. But you got to remember, 4 or 5 years ago, I was one of those people that hated philosophy. Okay, I was never taught philosophy growing up. I've never taken a philosophical course in my life. Besides, I took one course in college called Contemporary Rhetoric and Critical Thinking in Contemporary Rhetoric. Mm-hmm. We get to learn fallacies, so that I did take in college. But other than that, I'm self-taught. But I've been around experts for a very long time, so I've picked up a lot of things, right? And I read a lot, so I get that it is difficult. And I even was talking to a name drop here, my friend Dr. Alex Malpass, and I tell him, it's very difficult not having any formal training in this, because this is hard. This is really hard. He's like, it doesn't get any better kind of thing. He's like, philosophy is hard, and he's absolutely right. I mean, I can imagine how much more difficult it can get to these people that actually have dedicated their lives to learning it. It is a hard subject, but I get where you're coming from on that. I really honestly do. But here's my counter to that. If you're going to be in these discussions, you're never going to be very good at them unless you learn a little bit of philosophy, because like you said, as you recognize, these are philosophical conversations. You don't have to be adept at them. You don't have to be like, that heavy, but some basic things, because that's what the theist calls out when they see somebody engaging on these things, and they make the argument, well, atheists try to avoid their burden of proof. Well, they're right on that. I mean, you even did that here. You just say, well, I don't want to have the burden of proof. You are avoiding it. When a theist says that, I think that they're right about that.
I'm just going to jump in there. I'm not necessarily avoiding the burden of proof. I am avoiding what I consider to be a greater burden of proof, because to do the analogy I was hinting at earlier with the proving someone is or isn't in a house, from the perspective I prefer to look at things from is more of a scientific perspective, or not just a scientific perspective, but
Science
also... Say that again, sir?
Science doesn't prove anything. You never prove anything in science.
No, but there is a level of proof within science.
But again, when a theist is making the argument God exists, they're not positing it as a scientific claim, unless they're somebody who's an ID or something, and then a little bit more fair game.
All right, well, let's look at it a sec from, for example, just the perspective of a common conversation. Let's say there is or isn't someone in that house. I could search every room of that house and look in every cupboard, check the ceilings, check under the floorboards, and look everywhere, and they could still be somewhere I didn't look. So that is a significant burden of proof in order to prove that they're just 1 second. Let me finish my train of thought. There's one there that is a significant burden of proof to prove that they're definitely not in that house, because I might just be shit at looking. But all I have to do to prove they are in that house is catch a glimpse of them, or use any manner of other supporting evidence to show that person is in that house. It's easier in that regard to prove a positive than it is to prove a negative, I would say.
But this is why this is a fundamentally flawed approach, because again, the burden of proof has absolutely nothing to do with any of that, right? Literally nothing. So let me ask you this. So, and I hate using examples, because when it comes to existential things, it's kind of silly. But people will say, like, I have an invisible unicorn in my room, right? Okay. So, do you honestly think that I have potential to have a invisible pink unicorn in my room? Are you going to say that you do not have a belief right now that I do not have one, or are you going to be agnostic on that proposition?
I think it's very unlikely, to the point that I would say, no, you don't.
Okay, well, that's fair. So you did take a position on that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, you don't have to search my room.
Well, for a start, there's a considerable evidence that that's not how words go. There is considerable evidence for you not having one in the form that you've just said as an example.
Well, yeah, and okay, that's fine. That's good, because you're using rationalism to have an argument. By the same token, a strong atheist can rationalize that there are no gods. They don't have to go searching the entire universe for it. They can say, look it, man, every time we've seen something happen, we found a naturalistic explanation for it. Every time somebody's posited a god, we found that it wasn't. You can make a very strong, rational argument to say there are no gods.
In fact, those are arguments I do use in conversation.
Then why are you not a self-professed strong atheist? If you have the ability to meet your burden of proof, what's the issue?
Well, I don't. The position I put on myself for where I fall on, I think it was Dawkins that came up with that strong or weak atheist thing.
Everybody that I know that knows philosophy hates that scale. They think it's absolutely ridiculous.
Well, let's put myself on that scale. I'd put myself, if you look at the strong atheist position, I'd put myself just below that.
But that's stipulative, right? When we say strong atheism, it has nothing to do with that scale, right?
Mm.
Okay, so when you hear the term strong atheist, unless somebody for some strange reason is referring to the docking scale, which they shouldn't be, strong atheism means just a position that there are no gods. That's all it means. It has nothing to do with certainty at all.
Well, let's just use that then. I put myself very slightly below the strong atheist position because I am.
Well, there is no. Hang on. See, but it's a dichotomy. Either you are a strong atheist or you're not. There is no just below or above. It is all or nothing, right? There's no degrees of strong atheism. It is I believe there's a God or I do not believe there's a God.
Well, maybe I just like being non-committal, Steve.
I get that a lot, actually. No, I totally get that. Right? No, and by the way, it's funny you mentioned that. This is one of the reasons why classical logic sucks for this kind of stuff, right? People love throwing out words like dichotomy and stuff like that, but there actually is more nuance to these things. There's things like stochastic logic, fuzzy logic, multi-valued logic, which gives a lot more granularity to these subjects, a lot more nuances that you just don't have with something with a principle bivalence.
Well, let me put it
one or nothing.
Let me put it this way. I kind of look at this in the same way that I look at morality, because in order to be moral, I think you can do it in. I don't think objective morality is a thing, because I don't think there is any kind of a thing to give an objective scale, but I think you can look at morality in a mostly objective way if you use certain criteria, like this is good, this is bad. That's
well, I mean, Sam Harris has an argument from objective morality. So does Richard Carrier, which is pretty much
it's prescriptive and it's arbitrary in a sense. But
arbitrary has nothing to do with objective. Those are two different things.
Yeah, it can be done, though, is what I'm saying. But the point I'm getting at there is, in morality, I don't think anything is ever black or white, good or bad for definite. I think there are always shades of grey and always uncertainties, because
that isn't objective.
The world is so complicated that you can never look at something as definitely this is exactly that. There are always shades of grey and always
you're probably more of what's called a moral particularism, but that's has nothing to do with objectivism. Look at moral objectivism just means that you think there's a moral fact, but it's not contingent upon a human mind. And so the way we would look at that would be, let's say you and I want to play a game of chess. Would you agree that somebody arbitrarily created the rules of chess?
Yes.
But when you and I agree upon those rules now become objective. We now have an objective framework by which we are playing. Mathematics is the same way. We have arbitrary axioms, but math is objective. Morals would be the same way.
Yeah, that's what I meant with what I was saying. It's entirely arbitrary, but once you have put that arbitrary framework on it, you can look at it in an objective way.
Yes, and you're totally right on that, yes.
But the point I'm making is, I don't like to put that arbitrary framework in place in a way that is immovable. I don't like to put things in a way that I don't like to not give myself wiggle room.
No, I get that. A lot of philosophers are like that, actually. They're very non-committal. But I like to take definitive positions as much as possible, but you will find that certain positions provide tension to other positions, which leads people to existential crisis and just pulling your hair out, because
I don't like
sometimes you're like, I think
out.
both those are good ideas, but they're mutually exclusive, and you're like, God damn it.
Yeah, I don't like pulling my hair out, particularly. I don't like something...
Yeah, my age, neither do I.
Yeah, well, I wasn't going to say it, but...
But let me ask you this: are you a materialist, or are you a moral? Not moral. An ontological naturalist of any kind? I mean, do you believe in the supernatural?
Yeah. Before I comment on that, can you define those terms?
Yes. An ontological naturalist would hold that there is no supernatural, and a materialist would say that everything that exists is material. There's no spiritual. Everything's comprised of some kind of material component. And I'm going to include physicalism for that too, for the people that know the distinction. But so anything that exists that doesn't have any kind of spiritual or non-material component, a force would be included with this because of physicalism.
Well, I would say I'd call myself a de facto materialist, in the sense of I haven't seen anything that gives me any indication there's anything else.
So you're a non-materialist.
I'm open.
You're either a materialist or a non-materialist. There is no other choices. That is a
that's the
dichotomy.
thing. I don't like there being no other choices.
But then you're not being rational.
Yeah,
right?
I like to give myself wiggle room, as I said.
You
I will put it. Let me put it this way. I've seen no evidence that there is anything outside the material world, so I consider myself a materialist unless I see anything proving otherwise or suggesting otherwise.
But that's any position, right? I hold a position X until somebody convinces me otherwise. That's any position. You're just being superfluous.
Well, maybe I don't like taking positions.
Man, you must be terrible in bed then.
I like to give myself wiggle room in bed.
Yeah, I bet you do. I bet you do. Here's the thing, though. Again, when you get into these conversations, when you're not even willing to say I'm this or that, again, who wants to have a conversation like that? I want to know people's positions, and I want to know what they believe, right? But if somebody just says, "Look, I don't have any positions. I don't know what the hell I'm doing," they're not that interesting conversations,
oh,
right?
Well, thank you very much.
You. I understand what I like you, but I mean. When you're listening to them for, like, if you're arguing with a theist or you're arguing with even an atheist, because I do that a lot too, as you know, if you don't take a stance on something, then what's the point? Because then you're just seem wishy-washy, right?
I do take stances on things, but I try not to take them with such vigor and certainty that I can't adjust if things are proven. If it's demonstrated to me that position is faulty, I don't want to be locked into it with no, this is my position, I will defend it.
That's just pretty much anybody, right? I mean, there's certain positions I am certain on, and there's certain positions that I'm not. I am certain that I exist, right? I am absolutely certain of that, because it is a performance contradiction for me to say something like I am dead. That is called literally a performance contradiction. So I cannot be dead, and so in some way or shape or form, I do exist. Okay? So when you apply these types of logical reasoning, there are certain things you can be certain of. Now if somebody says, well, I'm a materialist, okay, but most of them will not say that they were certain of that, right? I think it's kind of hubris to say I'm absolutely certain about materialism. Now people will do that, don't get me wrong. But I agree with you. I don't take those types of hardline positions on many different subjects, right? I tend to error theory, but I'm not certain that's the best way to go, right? Yeah. I tend to not be a non-dualist, right? So that could be wrong. Who knows? But yeah, you still have to realize that either you are a materialist or you're not. There is no middle ground between the two.
Well, I'll say I am, pending evidence to the contrary.
Okay. Do you also agree that you would want your logical systems to be coherent and consistent? You want to be rational. Would you agree? Okay. Because every time I have a conversation, I do go in with it thinking there's a principle of rationality or a principle of reason, which means that somebody wants to be reasonable. I don't think people go out of their way to have irrational or unjustified beliefs. I really don't. Now, hopefully, that is the case, but there might be some people out there that are like that. But I do give them the principle of charity that people want to be rational. Okay, yeah. So you have just said, though, that you do hold materialism, right? So somebody shows you otherwise, correct?
Yep.
By being a materialist, logically, that entails you are a strong atheist. There's no possibility, logically, of not being a strong atheist if you're a materialist.
There's one instance where I will dispute you on that. That is, in the case of the universe, it is not currently known scientifically what existed before the Big Bang, or even if the concept of before the Big Bang is a meaningful concept or is possible. So, in that little gap there could be something that could be that you could term to be supernatural, because it is entirely outside the universe.
But it has nothing to do with your position. Your position is you're a materialist. What there could be, sure.
Yeah.
But you are a materialist.
That's what I'm saying. I don't want to say it's definitely not the case, but
you're not thinking about this critically. You hold a position. Could it be wrong? Yes. And by the way, the question of asking what happened before the Big Bang is nonsensical, because we can model 2t=0 using what's called boundary proposal by Stephen
Yeah,
Hawking.
that's why I say at the start there that it's not even known if it is possible for something to be outside that.
Right, but right now you are a materialist. That is your position. If you are a materialist, that entails, by necessity, by using logic, you have to be a strong atheist to be rational.
Don't you logic me, Steve?
Yeah. Well, this is what philosophy is logic and reason, right? But makes you a better person, interlocutor, when you go into the conversations, because a theist will call you out on these things. If a theist is doing exactly what I'm doing to you, which is just basically a Socratic method of asking questions, right? I'm not trying to trap you. I'm honestly not. Mm-hmm. But I'm showing you that in order to have a logically consistent system, in order to have something that is rational, you have to have certain you have to be able to recognize certain things like entailment. And if you are a materialist, or if you're an ontological naturalist, you are a strong atheist by necessity. There is no way out of that unless you don't want to be rational.
Mm-hmm. No, I can see where you're coming from there.
If I spent time with you, giving you helpful hints of how to basically be a more assertive or strong atheist, would you be okay with that? I mean, again, I'm not trying to change anybody's position on that. I'm just wanting to make sure that they're consistent, because it sounds like you justify your position.
Well, no, part of the thing that I do is part of the reason that I don't definitely say that. Part of the reason that I don't commit to positions in a definite sense is that I'm trying to keep not just keep my options open, but keep conversational lines open. Because I find in discussion, particularly with theists, but also on people that I disagree with on other things, if I shut down, say, no, I don't believe that, and if I definitely completely shut down that avenue, it makes the conversation, it limits the conversation.
It depends on what your type of conversation you're going for. I mean, I'm going to tell people my position, belief, not belief, whatever. So it really depends what your conversation is. But if I say, do you believe this? I mean, a person in an honest dialogue needs to answer one way or another, or something, right? And people often charge, oh, well, these are loaded questions. Let me tell you, I don't ask loaded or complex fallacy questions, right? They're called. I ask just basic questions, but a lot of people don't want to answer them because it leads to them noticing that they are being logically inconsistent or having a bad position. You answered them. You're not evasive. You seem to be somebody who wants to be
a little bit evasive.
Rational. Well, no, I don't think you're evasive on purpose. I think that I understand where you're coming from, and I get your position because I used to be kind of like that. I do understand, but you find that as you progress in these conversations and you learn more, you're able to take more of a stance because it's just coherent within your framework, right? One thing does entail another. For example, like there's what's called the epistemic closure principle. If I know P and P implies Q, I know Q. Okay. Now you don't have to hold to that principle. There's actually good reasons not to. But
I'd say a good reason not to would be he said implies. If P implies Q, that but imply doesn't necessarily demonstrate it doesn't necessarily demonstrate Q. It just implies Q.
But that's any rule of inference, right? Modus ponens is the rule of inference that always holds. P implies Q, P therefore Q. It's always a valid rule of inference. That is logic, right? That is how logic works. So if P implies Q, right? You're doing it as conditional. If P implies Q, P therefore Q. That is always valid logic.
Yeah.
So implying doesn't really have anything to do with it. If that is the case, if this condition is met, then it must mean this. Entailment is similar. If this be the case, then it must mean this.
So from a programming perspective, that would mean if this, then that happens.
Yes, same thing. Yeah, if that. Mm-hmm. That's basically modus ponens is an if-then thing for a computer.
Yeah. I did do programming for a little while, but I wasn't very good at it.
But I do got to wrap this up. I do unfortunately I didn't realize that I had an engagement tonight when I scheduled this with you.
All right, well, thank you for joining me, Steve. That was a very interesting discussion. What the hell else could I say in an outro?
Hail Satan?
Say again?
Hail Satan?
Well, no, because that might imply a position.
Exactly. Oh, you're so non-committal. You must be fun in relationships. I recognize that.
I did try to convert a theist once. I think it was like a Christian guy did try to convert him to be a follower of Shergorth, the Daedric Prince of Madness. I didn't mention that he was from Elder Scrolls.
Yeah, there's another in World of Warcraft. There's a god of madness too. But all right, buddy, I appreciate it, and I will catch you later on. Like I said, hit me up. Like I said, I'll be free this weekend, so. All right, buddy, I got a jet.
All right, I shall speak to you later then.
Thank you, good sir.
All right, I can see